Back in the 1970s, when life was simpler, music was groovier, and childhood was all about adventure. If you grew up in the 70s, you know it was a totally different world. There were no smartphones, no social media, just pure, unfiltered fun. Kids roamed the neighborhood until the streetlights came on. Saturday mornings were sacred for cartoons. And seatbelts? Yeah, those were more of a suggestion. This was the era of mixtapes, bell-bottoms, and the birth of blockbuster movies. We played outside until we were sunburned, drank straight from the garden hose, and made actual phone calls on a rotary dial. And let's not forget the music, from rock legends to disco fever, and some of the best one-hit wonders ever. So today, we're throwing it back with 30 reasons we're glad we grew up in the 70s, from the fashion to the freedom, and everything in between. Let's dive in. Absence of social media. The 70s was a period when kids roamed free, music had soul, and life wasn't filtered through a screen. If you grew up back then, you know exactly what I'm talking about. No social media, no constant notifications. And honestly, that might be the best thing about it. Think about it. There were no perfectly curated Instagram posts making you feel like your life wasn't exciting enough. No endless TikTok scroll keeping you up till 3 a.m. No Twitter drama pulling you into arguments with strangers. Instead, we actually lived in the moment. If you wanted to talk to a friend, you had to call their house phone and hope their mom didn't answer first. Or better yet, you just showed up at their door, because that's how things worked. And let's not forget, no social media meant no viral embarrassment. You could make a fool of yourself at a party, and by the next day it was just a funny story, not a worldwide meme. We weren't obsessed with likes, followers, or algorithms. We were outside, riding bikes, making mixtapes, and experiencing life without the pressure of digital perfection. So yeah, the 70s, simpler, freer, and honestly, kind of iconic. Saturday morning cartoons. Saturday mornings in the 1970s, a sacred ritual for every kid lucky enough to grow up in the golden age of cartoons. Before streaming, before on demand, before you could binge an entire season in one sitting. There was one universal truth. If you wanted your animated fix, you had to wake up early on Saturday. And let's be real, there was no better motivation to roll out of bed than an entire morning of top-tier cartoons. From Scooby-Doo, Where Are You?, solving mysteries to Super Friends, assembling the ultimate superhero squad, the lineup was unbeatable. Looney Tunes kept us laughing, the Flintstones brought prehistoric sitcom vibes, and Fat Albert taught us life lessons wrapped in comedy. And who could forget Schoolhouse Rock sneaking in education between commercials? But it wasn't just the shows, it was the experience. You'd stumble into the kitchen, pour yourself a bowl of sugary cereal, because nutrition was optional, and plant yourself in front of the TV for hours. No responsibilities, no worries, just pure animated bliss. Today everything's on demand, but something about those Saturday morning marathons made childhood feel a little more magical. And honestly, that's why growing up in the 70s was the best. Arcades and pinball machines. Alright, so living in the 70s was really quite legendary, especially if you were into gaming before gaming was even a thing. Arcades and pinball machines, they weren't just entertainment, they were a lifestyle. Picture this, you walk into a dimly lit arcade, the sounds of 8-bit chiptunes and clanging pinball bumpers filling the air. The glow of neon signs reflects off the glass of rows and rows of pinball machines, each one a masterpiece of flashing lights, ramps, and mechanical wizardry. Games weren't just about high scores, they were about skill, precision, and pure adrenaline. And let's not forget the rise of video arcades. Before home consoles took over, this was where the real action happened. Space Invaders, Asteroids, Pac-Man, these weren't just games, they were pop culture events. You'd slap your quarter down on the machine, claiming your place in the battle for high score dominance. It was social, competitive, and straight-up thrilling. No microtransactions, no pay-to-win nonsense, just you, your reflexes, and the flashing cabinet in front of you. The 70s gave us the golden age of arcades and pinball, and honestly, we wouldn't trade it for anything. Classic rock and disco. Alright, let's talk about probably two of the greatest reasons the 1970s were an absolute golden era, classic rock and disco. If you grew up in the 70s, you already know. If you didn't, well, you missed out on one of the most electrifying decades in music history. First up, classic rock. We're talking about Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, Queen, and Pink Floyd. Bands that didn't just make music, they defined a generation. Stadium anthems like Bohemian Rhapsody and Stairway to Heaven weren't just songs, they were experiences. The raw energy of electric guitars, powerful vocals, and lyrics that actually meant something? Yeah, that was peak rock and roll. But then disco came in and flipped the script. While rock had its epic guitar solos, disco had bass lines that made you move. The Bee Gees, Donna Summer, Chic. These legends made sure every dance floor was packed. Flashy outfits, the funky grooves, and of course the disco ball.
All of the people around us, they say, can they be that close?
It was all about good vibes and nonstop dancing. So whether you were headbanging to Aerosmith or doing the hustle at Studio 54, the 70s gave us the best of both worlds. And honestly, that's a pretty solid reason to be glad we grew up back then. Vinyl records and 8-tracks. So apart from the electrifying rock and disco that made growing up in the 70s absolutely legendary, we also had vinyl records and 8-tracks. If you were a music lover back then, you know exactly what I'm talking about. First off, vinyl records. These weren't just a way to listen to music, they were exciting experiences. You walked into a record store, flipped through bins of albums, and found that one perfect LP. The album art, iconic, the liner notes, a deep dive into the artist's world, and that moment when the needle dropped, pure magic. You didn't just listen, you became one with the music, you felt the music. And then there were 8-tracks. I know they weren't perfect, clunky cartridges, the mid-song track changes, but when you had an 8-track in your car, you were officially cool. Road trips with Zeppelin, Fleetwood Mac, or the Eagles playing on a loop, that was unbeatable. Today, music is instant, but back then, it was tangible. Collecting records, swapping 8-tracks with friends, music was a lifestyle, not just background noise. And that's why, if you grew up in the 70s, you know we had it good. Biking. The 70s, a time before smartphones, before helicopter parents, and most importantly, before we needed an app just to go outside. And you know what made it legendary? Bikes. Yeah, if you grew up in the 70s, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Your bike wasn't just transportation, it was freedom on 2 wheels. You'd wake up, hop on your banana seat Schwinn, and disappear for hours. No GPS, no cell phones, just you, your friends, and an unspoken rule. Be home before the streetlights came on, and guess what? It was glorious. We weren't trapped in the backseat of minivans or waiting for a ride. We were the ride. Need to get to a friend's house? Bike. Run out of candy money? Pedal to the corner store? Feeling adventurous? Cruise through neighborhoods, cut through dirt trails, maybe even build a ramp and risk a broken arm. No helmets, of course. And let's be real, biking everywhere meant we didn't need a gym membership. We were outside, moving, sweating, living. It was exercise, adventure, and rebellion all in one. So yeah, we're glad we grew up in the 70s, because back then, the world was our playground, and our bikes were the keys to it all. Drive-in theaters. If you grew up in this decade, you know exactly why drive-in theaters were the ultimate weekend destination. Picture this. You and your friends pile into a car, snacks hidden under the seats, ready for a double feature under the stars. The excitement builds as you roll into the lot, hook that little metal speaker onto your window, and wait for the giant screen to light up. And let's be real, half the fun wasn't even the movie. It was the whole experience. Drive-ins were a vibe. The smell of buttered popcorn mixed with fresh air, kids running around before the movie started, and that magical moment when the screen flickered to life. Whether you were there for a family night, a date, or just to hang out, it was an event. And the best part? Drive-ins had freedom. No assigned seating, no overpriced concessions, unless you actually bought them, and nobody kicking your seat from behind. It was movie watching your way. Sure, drive-ins aren't as common today, but for those of us who lived it, that nostalgia hits hard. And honestly, we wouldn't trade it for anything. Actual playtime. To be a child in the 70s. A time when kids actually played outside. No endless doom scrolling. No binge watching, no getting lost in an algorithm, just real playtime. And honestly, we wouldn't trade it for anything. Back then, our parents would send us outside with a simple rule: be home before dark, and that was it. No GPS tracking, no texting every 5 minutes, just us, our bikes, and an entire world to explore. We climbed trees, played kickball in the street, and built forts out of whatever we could find. Every summer day felt like an adventure, and the only screen time we had was when we watched Saturday morning cartoons. And let's talk about imagination, because we had to use it. No fancy gaming consoles with Ultra HD graphics. If we wanted a battle, we grabbed sticks and had sword fights. If we needed a spaceship, a cardboard box did the trick. Playtime wasn't just fun, it shaped who we were. Sure, today's tech is great, but let's be real. Nothing beats the freedom of a childhood spent outside, getting dirty, laughing with friends, and making up games on the fly. Actual playtime? That's why we're glad we grew up in the 70s. Schoolhouse rock. Alright, let's take a trip back to Saturday mornings in the 1970s. You've got your bowl of sugary cereal, you're parked in front of the TV, and just as your favorite cartoons take a break, boom, Schoolhouse Rock comes on. And somehow, you don't even mind. This wasn't just any educational programming. It was learning disguised as absolute bangers. I mean, who among us didn't absorb the entire US Constitution thanks to I'm Just a Bill? Or master multiplication with 3 as a magic number? These weren't just catchy tunes, they were core memories. Think about it. Before TikTok, before YouTube explainers, before Google, we had Schoolhouse Rock breaking down history, grammar, science, and even economics into bite-sized, animated jams. And it worked. A whole generation walked away knowing how conjunctions function and why the number 9 is mathematically wild. And let's be real, where's the modern equivalent? No offense to today's edutainment, but will kids in 50 years be humming songs about coding the way we still hum lolly lolly lolly? Get your adverbs here? Probably not. So yeah, growing up in the 70s had its perks. And if Schoolhouse Rock taught us anything, it's that learning can rock. Real cereal prizes. The 70s, a time when Saturday mornings meant two things: cartoons and tearing into a fresh box of cereal, hoping to score a real prize. And we're not talking about some flimsy QR code or a send-away offer that took 6 weeks to arrive. Nope, back then, cereal companies actually put legit toys right in the box.
You could win $1,000 worth of Mattel toys. You'll find your instant win game card in specially marked packages of these Kellogg cereals, or write for a free game card.
Remember digging elbow deep into a fresh pack of Cap'n Crunch or Lucky Charms, completely ignoring the actual cereal just to fish out that hidden treasure? Whether it was a glow-in-the-dark monster, a mini race car, or an actual comic book, those prizes were worth the sugar rush. And let's not forget the epic battles between brands. Kellogg's, Post, General Mills, each trying to outdo the other with cooler, crazier prizes. Secret spy rings, mini record players, even wacky wall walkers. It was a golden age of marketing and childhood joy. Today's kids, they'll never know the thrill of shaking a cereal box like a maraca, hoping the prize drops into the bowl. Sure, they have apps and digital freebies, but they'll never experience the simple, pure excitement of a real cereal prize. And that's why growing up in the 70s? Totally worth it, the simplicity of TV. Back in the 70s, TV felt way simpler, and life just felt easier. No endless streaming options, no infinite scroll, just a handful of channels that actually made choosing what to watch effortless. Back then, primetime meant gathering around the living room, tuning into Happy Days, The Brady Bunch, or MASH, shows that didn't need flashy CGI or 10 seasons of lore to hook you in. You just sat back and enjoyed it. And let's be real, commercials? They weren't the annoying interruption they are today. They were bathroom breaks built into the experience. No DVR, no rewinding. If you missed an episode, tough luck. See you next week. But that mattered because it made TV special. You weren't binging an entire series in one sitting. You were waiting, anticipating, and actually talking about last night's episode with friends the next day. And let's not forget Saturday morning cartoons. Waking up to Looney Tunes, Scooby-Doo, and Super Friends was a ritual. Today, kids have everything on demand, but back then, if you slept in, you missed out. TV in the 70s wasn't just entertainment, it was an event. And honestly, that's why we're glad we grew up in the golden age of simple television. Cool toys. As a child, growing up in the 70s was a truly enjoyable experience, a time when kids didn't just play with toys, they lived them. If you grew up in this glorious decade, you know exactly what I'm talking about. No screens, no apps, just pure, unfiltered fun with some of the coolest toys ever made. Let's start with Rock'em Sock'em Robots, a game that lets you literally punch your way to victory. Or how about Stretch Armstrong? That dude could stretch from one side of the room to the other, and somehow he never snapped in half. Science, magic, who cares? It was awesome. Then there were Hot Wheels and Evel Knievel stunt bikes. We'd build insane jumps, send those tiny cars and motorcycles flying, and probably break a few lamps in the process. And speaking of danger, clackers, those hard plastic balls on a string, were practically medieval weapons disguised as toys. Parents had no idea what they were unleashing. And let's not forget action figures. Mego superheroes, Star Wars figures, and G.I. Joe with Kung Fu grip. These weren't just toys, they were the foundation of epic backyard adventures. So yeah, growing up in the 70s, totally ruled. The toys were cooler, the fun was wilder, and honestly, we wouldn't trade it for anything. Phone freedom. The 70s were a time when a phone was just a phone. No endless notifications, no doom scrolling, no social media drama. Just you, your friends, and actual freedom. Back then, if you left the house, you were gone. No one tracked your location. No one expected you to text back in 5 seconds. If someone wanted to reach you, tough luck. They had to wait until you got home and checked your actual answering machine, if you even had one. And let's talk about making plans. No last-minute cancellations because I got caught up in something. If you said, meet me at the mall at 3, you meant it. You showed up. You trusted people to be where they said they'd be. Imagine that. Phones weren't glued to our hands either. Conversations happened face-to-face, not through texts. You'd call your best friend, chat for hours on a landline, twisting that curly cord around your fingers, hoping no one picked up on the other line. No robocalls, no spam texts, no 24/7 work emails, just pure, uninterrupted living. So yeah, growing up in the 70s gave us absolute phone freedom, and honestly, we kind of miss it. Roller skating rinks. The 70s was an exciting era, from bell-bottoms to groovy tunes, and the absolute best place to be on a Friday night. The roller skating rink. If you grew up in this era, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you didn't, buckle up, because you missed out on one of the most iconic experiences of the decade. Picture this: dim lights, a disco ball spinning, and the unmistakable sound of wheels gliding across the polished wooden floor. Whether you were showing off your best moves or just trying to stay upright, the rink was the place to be. And the music? Unreal. From Bee Gees to Donna Summer, every song made you feel like you were in your own personal movie. Not to mention the outfits. Striped tube socks, short shorts, and feathered hair were basically required. The roller rink wasn't just a place to skate, it was a social hub. You had your first crush, epic races with friends, and maybe even a slow skate with that special someone. Roller rinks made growing up in the 70s unforgettable, and honestly, we wouldn't trade it for anything. The birth of blockbuster movies? The 1970s marked the birth of the modern blockbuster, forever changing cinema and making it an unforgettable era for movie lovers. If you grew up in the 70s, you witnessed the magic firsthand as Hollywood transformed into an industry of high-stakes entertainment, bringing larger-than-life stories to the big screen. It all began with Jaws, 1975, Steven Spielberg's suspenseful shark thriller that became the first true summer blockbuster, creating long lines at theaters and proving that a film could be both a critical and commercial sensation. Soon after, Star Wars, 1977, revolutionized science fiction, dazzling audiences with groundbreaking special effects, thrilling action, and an epic adventure that spawned a cultural phenomenon. These films, alongside Rocky, 1976, Superman, 1978, and Alien, 1979, gave audiences heart-pounding excitement and unforgettable heroes. Growing up in the 70s meant experiencing these cinematic masterpieces in their original glory, before streaming, before endless remakes. Seeing these films in packed theaters, sharing the collective awe, and discussing every twist and turn at school the next day was an unmatched experience. The 70s didn't just give us movies, it gave us the blockbuster era. An exhilarating reason to be grateful for growing up in a time when cinema truly felt like magic. The original Star Wars craze? The 1970s was a golden era for pop culture, but nothing defined it quite like the original Star Wars craze. When Star Wars: A New Hope hit theaters in 1977, it wasn't just a movie, it was a phenomenon. Kids and adults alike were captivated by George Lucas's space epic, with its groundbreaking special effects, unforgettable characters, and thrilling story of good versus evil. Growing up in the 70s meant experiencing Star Wars in its purest form, before endless sequels, spin-offs, and CGI-heavy re-releases. We were the first to gasp at Darth Vader's menacing entrance, cheer for Luke Skywalker's triumph, and dream of piloting the Millennium Falcon. Lines wrapped around theaters, and fans saw the movie multiple times because home video wasn't yet a thing. Then came the toys. Kenner's action figures became instant must-haves. Playgrounds turned into Tatooine battlegrounds. We traded Star Wars cards, wore graphic tees, and reenacted lightsaber duels with plastic swords. The hype was organic, the excitement was real, and there was nothing like it. The 70s gave us the magic of Star Wars when it was fresh, unfiltered, and truly revolutionary. And that's one big reason we're glad we grew up in that incredible decade. Simple summers. Growing up in the 1970s meant experiencing summers in a way that feels almost magical in hindsight. Simple, carefree, and filled with adventure. Unlike today's screen-heavy world, summer in the 70s was about being outside from morning until dusk, barely a glance at the clock. Mornings often began with a quick breakfast, before heading out on bikes, riding through the neighborhood or to the local park with friends. There were no cell phones, just an unspoken rule to be home when the streetlights flickered on. Swimming at the community pool, running through sprinklers, or having water balloon fights were the best ways to beat the heat. Afternoons brought popsicles on the front porch, games of kick the can, or impromptu baseball in an empty lot. If you were lucky, your family might take a road trip in a wood-paneled station wagon, windows down, music from an AM radio filling the air. Evenings meant fireflies, bonfires, and telling ghost stories while roasting marshmallows. Summers in the 70s weren't about expensive vacations or structured schedules. They were about freedom, friendship, and the kind of nostalgia that reminds us why we're grateful to have grown up in a time when the simplest joys meant the most. Riding in the back of a station wagon. Growing up in the 1970s meant a childhood filled with freedoms that today's kids might never experience. One of the best of such experiences? Riding in the back of a station wagon, no seatbelts, no booster seats, just a wide open space where imagination ran wild. Before the days of strict safety regulations, the back of a station wagon was a rolling playground. We stretched out on the long road trips, playing cards, reading comic books, or just staring out the back window, waving at cars behind us. Facing backward in the way back seat was a thrill, giving us a unique view of the world as we sped down the highway. It was like our own secret clubhouse on wheels. Parents didn't micromanage. They simply trusted us to entertain ourselves. Siblings built forts with luggage, fought over invisible boundary lines, and when no one was looking, crawled over the seats like little gymnasts. Snacks were shared, stories were told, and car games were invented on the spot.
With only one of the twin seats folded down, the kids have a handy desk and chair set up to help pass the time. And at the forward end of the two seats, the floor forms a shelf big enough to hold anything from armies to Barbie dolls.
Sure, safety standards have improved, but there was something magical about that era. When kids roamed free, road trips felt like adventures, and the back of a station wagon was the best seat in the house. Playing records backward for hidden messages. Growing up in the 70s meant experiencing one of the most bizarre yet thrilling music-related conspiracies. Playing records backward to uncover hidden messages. This was the golden era of vinyl, where music wasn't just something you listened to. It was something you explored. Many of us spent hours spinning records in reverse, convinced that bands like Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, and Pink Floyd had embedded secrets, often eerie, messages in their songs. The idea of backmasking took off when rumors spread that certain rock songs contained subliminal messages that could only be heard when played in reverse. Whether it was the Beatles' infamous Paul is Dead theory or the alleged satanic messages in rock anthems, it added a sense of mystery and rebellion to music. Even if most of it was just coincidence or the power of suggestion, it made listening to records an interactive and almost mystical experience. In an age before streaming and digital music, this was a way to engage deeply with albums. It gave us a sense of adventure and even a little harmless mischief. Looking back, it's one of those uniquely 70s experiences that makes us glad we grew up during a time when music felt like an enigmatic analog puzzle waiting to be solved. Mom's Tupperware parties. Growing up in the 70s was a unique experience, filled with quirky traditions that today seem almost nostalgic. One of the most iconic of them? Mom's Tupperware parties. These gatherings were more than just a sales pitch. They were a social event, a community builder, and a glimpse into the colorful plastic-filled future of our kitchens. Tupperware parties weren't just about buying airtight containers, they were about camaraderie. Our moms would gather in someone's living room, armed with coffee, gossip, and an infectious enthusiasm for burping lids. The air buzzed with laughter, the unmistakable scent of percolated coffee, and the excitement of winning a free measuring cup set.
Jams keep jammier, hams keep hammier, cakes keep cakier, flakes keep flakier. Tupperware freshness, that's our promise. Look at all the ways we keep it.
As kids, we got to sneak in and marvel at the rainbow of stackable bowls, modular containers, and Frischer, and those weird jello molds that seemed to appear at every potluck. These parties also represented a simpler time before online shopping and impersonal transactions. Women supported each other's home businesses, enjoyed an afternoon away from daily chores, and brought home practical, indestructible pieces of kitchenware that we still see in our parents' cabinets today. Tupperware parties may seem outdated now, but they remain a fun, kitschy reminder of why growing up in the 70s was so special, full of community, connection, and a whole lot of plastic. CB radios. Up next, we have CB radios. The 1970s were a golden era for many things. Bell-bottoms, muscle cars, and rock and roll. But one of the standout cultural icons of the decade was the CB Citizens Band radio. For those who grew up in the 70s, CB radios were more than just communication devices. They were a way of life, a sense of freedom, and a link to an entire underground community of truckers, road trippers, and everyday adventurers. Before cell phones and the internet, CB radios connected people in a way that felt rebellious and exciting. Whether you were a long-haul trucker or a teenager with a radio in your dad's station wagon, having a CB meant you were part of a secret world. Everyone had a handle, cool creative nicknames that gave you an identity on the airwaves. Conversations were filled with insider lingo like 10-4, Breaker 1-9, and Smokey on your tail. Popularized by movies like Smokey and the Bandit and TV shows like The Dukes of Hazzard, CB culture defined an era. It wasn't just about talking, it was about being part of something bigger. For those of us who grew up in the 70s, CB radios remind us of a time when communication was fun, spontaneous, and full of personality. Handwritten notes in class. Growing up in the 70s meant learning in a world before laptops, tablets, and smartphones took over the classroom. One of the best parts of that era was the art of handwritten notes. Unlike today's students who rely on digital devices, we had no choice but to put pen to paper, which came with plenty of benefits. For one, handwriting notes helped us retain information better. Studies today confirm what we learned through experience. Writing by hand engages the brain more actively, improving comprehension and memory. When we jotted things down, we weren't just copying. We were processing and summarizing on the go. There was also a certain charm to handwritten notes. Each person's writing style was unique, and sometimes swapping notes with a friend meant deciphering beautiful or barely legible cursive. Doodling in the margins, underlining key points, and even using different colored pens made learning personal and creative. Not to mention, handwritten notes meant fewer distractions. Without the constant pull of notifications or the temptation to browse the internet, we focused better. Our notes were tangible proof of our efforts, something we could flip through long after the lecture ended. In today's digital world, handwritten notes are a lost art, but they're one reason we're grateful to have grown up in the 70s. Sears catalog. Up next, we will be talking about something pretty much defined growing up in the 70s, the Sears catalog. And if you were a kid back then, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This wasn't just a catalog. No, this was the catalog, the ultimate wish book, the original internet shopping spree, except it was made of actual paper, weighed about 10 pounds, and could double as a doorstop. Every year when that big old book landed in your mailbox, it was like Christmas came early. And speaking of Christmas, the Holiday Wish Book edition, pure magic. You'd flip through those glossy pages, circling your dream toys, daydreaming about slot car tracks, Stretch Armstrongs, and that shiny Schwinn bike that maybe, just maybe, Santa would deliver. But it wasn't just for kids. Your mom was eyeing avocado green appliances, and your dad was checking out the latest in plaid bell-bottom fashion. And let's not forget the underwear section, a rite of passage for every awkward preteen flipping too far. The Sears catalog was an experience, a ritual, a time capsule of the 70s in all its mustard yellow wood-paneled glory. And honestly, that's why we're glad we grew up in the 70s, because nothing today quite compares. Sitcoms. We can all agree that growing up in the 70s had its ups and downs, but if there's one thing that made it absolutely legendary, it was the sitcoms. I mean, come on. The 70s gave us some of the greatest TV comedies of all time. First off, Happy Days. You weren't cool unless you tried to do the Fonzie I at least once. This show wasn't just about nostalgia, it created nostalgia. And then there was MASH. Who knew a sitcom set during war could be so smart, so funny, and still hit you right in the feels? And let's not forget The Jeffersons, a show that broke barriers while keeping us laughing. Or Three's Company, which made the whole misunderstanding trope into an art form. And if you were into family-friendly chaos, the Brady Bunch and Good Times had you covered. These shows had it all: iconic theme songs, unforgettable catchphrases, and characters that felt like family. Before streaming and endless options, we had to wait for our favorite shows. And somehow that made them even better. So yeah, growing up in the 70s, absolutely worth it, because the sitcoms made it golden. Pet rocks and mood rings. Up next, let's talk about two of the weirdest, most pointless, yet somehow legendary fads of the 1970s. Pet rocks and mood rings. If you grew up in the 70s, you know exactly why these were a big deal. And if you didn't, well, buckle up, because this is peak retro nostalgia. First up, pet rocks. Yes, people in the 70s were literally paying for a rock. But not just any rock. This was your rock. It came in a little box with air holes, because obviously your pet needed to breathe. It didn't bark, didn't shed, and never needed food. Talk about the perfect low-maintenance pet. It was ridiculous, but also genius. And then we had mood rings, because in the 70s, apparently, we needed jewelry to tell us how we felt. These little wonders would change color based on your body temperature, which totally meant they were reading your soul, right? Whether it turned blue for calm or black for moody, it was the ultimate accessory for dramatic teen angst. Looking back, it's hilarious that we bought into these trends, but that's what made the 70s magical. It was a time when even a rock could be fun. And that's why we're glad we grew up in this groovy era. Long car rides without screens. The 70s was a time before smartphones, tablets, and in-car entertainment systems. Back then, a long car ride meant one thing: raw, unfiltered boredom. And honestly, that's exactly why we're glad we grew up in that era. Picture this. You're crammed in the back seat, wedged between your siblings, windows down because air conditioning was a luxury. There's no iPad, no Netflix, no Bluetooth, just the endless stretch of highway and whatever scratchy AM radio station your parents tolerated. So what did we do? We got creative, we played the license plate game, we counted cows, we argued over whose turn it was to sit by the window, and when desperation kicked in, we resorted to making up ridiculous stories about the people in passing cars. Boredom wasn't the enemy. It was the fuel for imagination. It made us observant, forced us to talk, to bond, to create inside jokes that still make us laugh today. Sure, today's kids have screens to pass the time, but we had something better: the ability to sit in silence, to daydream, to let our minds wander. And that's a skill that's hard to come by these days. So yeah, long car rides without screens, we wouldn't trade them for anything. Eating TV dinners on a TV tray. Let's take a trip back to the 1970s when life was simpler, hairstyles were bigger, and the height of fine dining was a Salisbury steak straight out of the freezer. If you grew up in the 70s, you know exactly what I'm talking about. TV dinners on a fold-out TV tray, parked right in front of the family's wood-paneled zenith. There was something special about peeling back that crinkly aluminum foil, revealing a perfectly compartmentalized meal mystery meat and gravy, mashed potatoes with a butter crater, and that one dessert section that was either lava hot or still frozen. It was the golden age of convenience, when Swanson was the real MVP of weeknight meals. Sure, today's kids have Uber Eats, but they'll never know the joy of balancing a flimsy tray on shag carpet, watching Happy Days reruns, and feeling like kings of their own little dining domain. No overprotective parenting. The 70s, a time when kids roamed free, scraped knees were a daily occurrence, and helicopter parenting wasn't even a thing yet. If you grew up in this era, you know exactly what I mean. Parents weren't tracking us with GPS, texting every 5 minutes, or bubble wrapping us against the dangers of, well, life. We drank from the hose, rode bikes without helmets, and stayed out until the streetlights flickered on. Sure, there were risks, but guess what? We learned independence. We figured things out without Google. We made mistakes, got into trouble, and most importantly, grew from it. There was no such thing as play dates. You just knocked on your friend's door and asked if they could come outside. And somehow we all survived. So yeah, modern parenting has its perks, but looking back, we wouldn't trade our wild, unsupervised childhoods for anything. The 70s made us tough, and we wouldn't have it any other way. The feeling of pure freedom. And finally, let's talk about the real reason growing up in the 70s was unbeatable. Pure freedom. No cell phones, no helicopter parents tracking your every move, just you, your bike, and a full day of adventure. You'd leave the house in the morning, and as long as you were back by dinner, no one questioned where you'd been. You could roam the neighborhood, build forts in the woods, or just disappear to a friend's house without checking in every 5 minutes. And let's not forget the music blasting Zeppelin, the Eagles, or the Stones from a record player, feeling like you owned the world. No streaming, no curated playlists, just flipping vinyl and living in the moment. It was a time when kids were kids, independence was earned, and life wasn't lived through a screen. If you grew up in the 70s, you know freedom wasn't just a feeling, it was a way of life. And there you have it, 30 reasons why growing up in the 70s was nothing short of legendary. From Saturday morning cartoons, to cruising on banana seat bikes, we had a childhood that was equal parts wild, weird, and wonderful. No smartphones, no streaming, just good old-fashioned fun with a side of questionable fashion choices. Whether it was the music, the toys, or the sheer freedom of the era, the 70s gave us memories that still hit different today. So if you grew up in this groovy decade, consider yourself lucky, because they just don't make childhoods like that anymore. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay nostalgic, folks.